My name is Jennifer Hicks. I'm the OpenSim R&D Manager and also the Associate Director of the National Center for Simulation and Rehab Research. I'll be serving as the moderator for today's webinar. I'm pleased to welcome our two presenters today, Brad Davidson and Casey Myers, who are joining us from the University of Denver. They will be talking about a probabilistic tool to quantify the effects of population variability and model uncertainty. Next slide, please. Before we get started, just a little bit of background. So OpenSim is a freely available software application for visualizing musculoskeletal structures and simulating movements of humans and animals. OpenSim includes tools for general purpose inverse dynamics, optimization to estimate muscle and joint forces, methods that allow you to create simulations from motion capture data, and then tools that allow you to analyze and visualize the results of those simulations. So the first goal of our webinar series is to showcase the cutting-edge research that's being performed with those tools in OpenSim. OpenSim is also a growing and geographically diverse community of users. So the second goal of our webinar series is to provide a platform for the OpenSim community to communicate and collaborate and share new research tools like Brad and Casey are doing today. Next slide. So before we get started, a couple quick reminders about the format of the webinar. So we'll take your questions at the end of the presentation using the Q&A panel. You can start typing those in as soon as you'd like, but we'll address those at the end. If you need any additional technical help, you can consult the guide on our website. So with that, I'd now like to introduce our speakers. So you guys can bring up the next slide that has your pictures. Oh, no pictures, at least your names. So our speakers today are first Bradley Davidson, who's an assistant professor in mechanical engineering and the director of the Human Dynamics Laboratory at the University of Denver. He's also a clinical assistant professor at the University of Colorado and Schutz's Medical Campus. Brad's research focuses on understanding and characterizing human movement across healthy and pathologic populations. He uses both in vivo experimental measurement as well as musculoskeletal modeling. Some of the applications he focuses on are fall prevention, spine stability, rehab after total joint surgery, and muscle coordination and proprioception in the lumbopelvic region. Brad is joined by Casey Myers. He is a PhD student at the University of Denver in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, working in Dr. Davidson's lab. He has a BS from the University of Colorado Boulder and an NMS from the University of California in Davis. His research is focused on developing probabilistic tools for musculoskeletal simulation and applying them to investigate the function of the hip and the spine, which we'll hear more about today. I'm really excited to have Brad and Casey speak at our webinar today. They are past attendees of several advanced user OpenSim workshops. Brad's also the winner of an Outstanding Researcher Award from the National Center for Simulation and Rehab Research. So with that, I will let you guys take it away and tell us about your tool you've developed in OpenSim.
All right. Thank you, Jen. So first off, I need to acknowledge two other collaborators, which are Kevin Chauvin and Pete Labs, which have dedicated a whole lot of effort on this project, and also our funding sources, which are the Gustafson Family Foundation. And also, this was kickstarted, as Jen mentioned, at one of the National Center for Simulation and Rehab Research advanced workshops. So instead of starting out with uncertainty, because that's a negative term, let's talk about confidence. So what gives you confidence in your OpenSim models? And we generate this confidence probably in several different ways. I mean, the first step is probably just getting the model to converge. You know, not having the knee behind the head and the kinematics, and then obtaining reasonable muscle forces when we look at our plots. And so many of us have systematic processes in which we perturb our models, and we find out just how robust that is. And what we're after here when we do this is the ability to be confident that we can move on to interpret the outputs of our simulations in clinically meaningful ways. Or, if we turn this around a bit, how does someone who reads your paper have confidence in your simulations? So in experimental investigations, when we report data, we include variances and confidence intervals And in fact, we wouldn't even have a paper published.
Hey, Brad, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Maybe are you speaking right into the microphone?
Let me move a little closer. Is this better, Jen?
Yeah, I think that's a little better.
Okay. Oh, hold on. Is this better?
I guess go ahead. I think that's better.
All right. Just so we're in the right one. So back to where we were in experimental investigations. When we report data, we always include variances like standard deviation and confidence intervals. And in fact, we probably wouldn't even publish a paper without these metrics. But as it is right now, there are really no defined standards in our community on how to assess or present these values. And so this is timely because right now, anyone with a computer can run a sophisticated musculoskeletal simulation. And so, like with OpenSim, we are able to generate complex equations of motion and computational templates for anatomical structures and solvers that are really accessible to anyone. Computational speed isn't near the issue that it was 10 years ago. And so we can generate these models fast and be confident in what we're getting. And also gone are the days in which each laboratory running a musculoskeletal simulation is creating their own custom platform from scratch. So it really allows us an opportunity to be able to compare and really look at these variability questions. And so one of the key challenges that we have is how do we quantify our simulations when we have so many parameters? With these major improvements in the models, one of the major improvements is anatomic detail. And so, for example, the Arnold lower extremity model that we use in some of our work, we use 88 muscles, and the muscle architecture is greatly improved over previous models. And we have 4 properties to select typically. So physiological cross-sectional area, pronation angle, tendon flat length, maximum velocity. And if our model has 88 muscles, that's 352 parameters to contend with and to get right. And so it's not just muscle parameters that we can potentially misquantify. It can be body segment parameters, experimental kinematics, external forces, and so forth. So if you think a moment about your own simulations, then what is it that we're putting into, or you're putting into your models that we have high degrees of confidence or low degrees of confidence? And so this leads us to what we're going to do today. We split this into 3 parts, and I'm going to present a survey of the underlying concepts of probabilistic reliability and sensitivity. And I'll introduce 2 approaches to run these probabilistic analyses. The first is Monte Carlo analyses, which many of you have heard of, and the second is an estimation method called advanced mean value. Following that, Casey's going to present findings from a recent publication that we have in the Annals of Biomedical Engineering that apply this framework of analysis to reporting propagation of uncertainty through OpenSim tools. And then last, which is really the meat of this presentation, Casey's going to demonstrate the OpenSim interface that he created as part of his PhD work. And what's great here is now anyone will have the ability to apply the probabilistic analyses to your own models. So while we're talking, before we get to the demonstration part, I urge you, if you haven't already, to go to simtk.org, home, prob_tool, and download the user's guide, which Casey will be talking out of in his part of the presentation.
Brad, sorry to interrupt again. Can you try moving still closer to that microphone or speaking up a little bit louder?
Sure. All right, so let's start with OpenSim tools. So the OpenSim platform provides us with a series of simulation tools to create our musculoskeletal simulations. And so we're modeling this and representing this here as a deterministic function that takes in experimental data and then estimates the outputs using the input parameters that we provide. And so the outputs here are a function of the inputs that we've shown here as x1, x2 through x1. And this can be any OpenSim tool such as inverse kinematics, dynamics, static optimization, and so forth. And then here's where our confidence comes into play. In reality, there's variance that's associated with every input. And this can be due to normal errors in accuracy that occur in experimental data, or it can be uncertainty in the parameters that we use. So I mentioned the Hill muscle model parameters earlier. And so these actually have a distribution of inputs that we can then put into the simulation that we need to make a choice from. And this necessarily leads to to a distribution in the output variables as well. And so the principle is that we combine a stochastic signal, like we see here in the input distributions, with a deterministic model, such as the OpenSim tools, then we get a stochastic output distribution. Really quickly, is this sounding any better? Is that loud enough?
It's not really too much louder, actually, Brad. So if you can, I'm not sure what's going on. I guess Casey sounded okay in the sound check.
We're using the same mic. So yeah, let's see if we can find out something here. Well, I apologize.
Oh, now it sounds good.
Oh, it's better now.
Now it's better now.
Okay, all right, great. All right, well then we'll keep going. And so what I was saying is that this necessarily leads to a variance in the outputs, in which we have a distribution of the outputs that would appear in a stochastic form. And so the principle here that we would combine a stochastic signal with a deterministic model isn't new in our community of musculoskeletal modeling, or even in OpenSim. And there's plenty of good examples of this. A handful of groups have used this Monte Carlo simulation to investigate interactions of these parameters and commented on variability in the output. So, for example, Jeff Reinbold, when he was with PJ Freckley, looked at these parameters. Joe Langendorfer has a great paper, and a Karen Reynolds group, and then also Marcus Pandy's group. And these are all very good papers. I commend them to anyone. In addition, just a couple weeks ago, there was a paper published by Valente, who I'll mention in just a moment, about subject-specific musculoskeletal models that are robust to uncertainties in parameter identification. And I also want to point out two other recent works. The first from Wendy Murray's group, in which Sarah Woolman did the work and validated the distribution of thumb forces from simulations against experimental data. So this is a validation approach. And in addition to this, also from Valente, simulated hip abductor weakness as a clinical perspective using Monte Carlo. And so with that, let's discuss the Monte Carlo just for a moment. And I won't dwell on this because we're mostly familiar with this, so I'm assuming that we are. Now, a Monte Carlo simulation, because we have a distribution of our inputs, is that we're going to randomly sample our inputs according to these distributions. They can be whatever distributions that we assign to the parameters, and it will simulate each combination of input distributions. And then we'll generate the probability density functions, which are our output distributions. Now, I'm going to call this the gold standard of probabilistic modeling. And the reason why is because it always generates a complete probability distribution based on all the inputs, and it models all of the interactions of the input data without fail. And the other thing is it's really straightforward, and we'll take implementation because we're sampling from the distributions and you apply that sampling. The cons to this aren't insignificant. The results are highly dependent on the number of iterations, and which Casey will show later with the number of iterations that we use. And as a result, the computational effort can be extremely high. And so once we have these probability density functions of the output, it's time to represent the findings. And a simple and straightforward method to do this that I mentioned earlier in some of the earlier papers is to report the first and second moments, statistical moments. So this is the mean and the variance of the model output. But we have a wealth of information in these output probability density functions, as well as the input probability density functions. And so the second approach, and this is what we'll dwell on today, is really based in reliability engineering. We're borrowing these concepts of confidence and reliability from this field, which has traditionally been in structural engineering and failure criteria. And so here are the two main questions we're dealing with. The first is, how reliable are the simulation outputs when uncertainty is present? Or in other words, think of it as, how likely is it that the results that we have are actually correct? And then second, are which parameters actually make a difference in the output of the simulation if we change this parameter? So this is a question of sensitivity. And so with the first, we're going to be looking at this in terms of a confidence bound. And a confidence bound is simply the probability that a value lies above or below a chosen threshold. So for example, if we choose the 50th percentile or the 50th percentile threshold, we have a 50% chance of being above or below that bound. I think that's obvious. And when we put this into a bound, a confidence bound, we're now bounding those thresholds, and we would say that there's a 90% probability that the true model output lies between the lower confidence bound, let's say the 5th percentile, and the 95th percentile. So this would be a 90% confidence bound. Now for a second question, which parameters make a difference in the output of the simulation if we change, and this is our question of sensitivity, we have to realize there are many different ways to calculate sensitivity. In our opinion, the most insightful that we found is based on a simple correlation coefficient with the corresponding slope of the output versus the input. And so here the correlation coefficient is an indicator of the degree of sensitivity, and the slope will give us an estimated ratio of how the output changes with respect to the input. And now, with Monte Carlo, we can move to parameter estimation methods. And with Monte Carlo, remember, we get a complete picture of these metrics because we're exploring the entire input space that are bounded by our input distributions. But remember, this can take thousands of runs. I mean, your computer may be churning and probably will be churning for a long time. So an alternative way of obtaining these data are based on reliability methods that drastically reduce the run times, but yet still produce accurate results. And this is by estimating the confidence bounds and sensitivity using most probable point methods. There are several options and ways to do this, and here we're going to focus on advanced mean value estimation. So to demonstrate this concept, let's reduce the parameter space to only two input parameters, an x1 and an x2, and a single output parameter, y. And when we do this, we now have two input variables, and if we model this in terms of our output as a function of our input, we get a joint probability distribution, and we can view that as this mountain, if you will, and here's the contour plot of it. And the steps to do this are that we normalize the variables using a z-distribution, which puts the mean right at 0. And then after that, we're going to approximate our percentiles, whether it's our 5th percentile, 90th percentile, 60th percentile, it doesn't matter, using what we call the limit state function. And this is simply the desired percentile that we're after. And to do that, we find the gradient, and then we advance the mean, which is the gradient at the top. We advance the mean toward that point, and then evaluate that parameter using a really well-known algorithm. And from that, we can get the most probable point at which that confidence bound exists. And so here's how it addressed our questions. So for our first of how reliable the simulation outputs in the presence of uncertainty, we get our confidence bound. Remember, it's going to be a lower and an upper bound that we're interested in. But instead of dealing with the full probability distribution that we did before, we don't need to generate a probability distribution function at all. We can simply estimate what those bounds are with a more direct method. And each bound, instead of requiring thousands of iterations, requires an n+1 iterations, where n is the number of input parameters. And so we'll have to do n+1 iterations for each bound. Now regarding sensitivity, we go back to the way that our probability distribution function looks like for our output. We generate what's called an importance factor, which is the length of the component of this vector that goes from the origin O to the most probable point. It gives us a degree of sensitivity for each of our input variables. And with this, however, there is a trade-off because we don't get any additional insight into numerical change of the output relative to the input. And so there are pros and cons here. It's very fast, it's very efficient, and very accurate in most systems. And the difficulties are it is an approximate method, so we get that because we don't generate those full PDFs, and it's also difficult to implement. And Casey will be addressing that when he's presenting the problem tool that he created. So I'm going to turn it over to Casey, and he's going to present the results from our study and take it for the rest of the webinar.
All right, thanks, Brad. How am I sounding? Is that going to work? As far as the sound, I apologize if it's still a bit.
Casey, you're coming through loud and clear.
All right, great. Okay, yeah, so like you said, like Brad said, I'm going to focus on our specific applications of the probabilistic musculoskeletal modeling. Our first objective was to quantify the impact of uncertainty propagation in a musculoskeletal simulation of gait. So I'm going to walk through our methods, some of our specific results as far as actual data for the confidence bounds, the most influential sources of uncertainty along that workflow for a simulation of gait, and then the most highly sensitive parameters as far as the individual input parameters that might have the largest sensitivity. Those are all going to be actual data from the paper that was published. And then our second objective is to assess the accuracy and efficiency of AMV compared to the gold standard Monte Carlo. So we know that a typical OpenSim workflow goes from calculating inverse kinematics to inverse dynamics and finally to muscle force optimization. It's not the only way to calculate muscle forces, but this is a common workflow that we see in the literature. You begin with your input to your inverse kinematics being your marker data, any weights that you want to place on your markers, and the anthropometry. And we know that there's a fair amount of uncertainty associated with your marker data that I've denoted with the little distribution symbol. And you may have more confidence in your marker weights and the anthropometry that you put into that. You then calculate your output joint angles from that tool. The joint angles then become the input into your inverse dynamics along with your body segment parameters, which also have some uncertainty associated with that. And you combine that with your ground reaction forces, with which we know we have a lot of confidence in the measurements of our ground reaction force. So again, these are those sources of uncertainty here that then go through and you calculate joint moments that then become the input into muscle force optimization along with your muscle tendon properties, and finally get to muscle forces. So you can see how any source of uncertainty along this chain can propagate from one stage to the next. So for us, for our specific probabilistic simulation, we began with a deterministic input with the baseline kinematics, moments, and muscle forces from a single stride of gait and our measured ground reaction forces. And then for the probabilistic inputs, we simulated marker error in two ways. First, in marker placement error, so misplacing a marker relative to the landmark you're looking for, and also in movement artifact, so that marker moving relative to the landmark it's associated with during dynamic movement. And we did that by perturbing marker trajectories and sending that to the inverse kinematics tool. The second source of uncertainty we looked at were body segment parameters, specifically for mass, center of mass location, and moment of inertia for each segment of the lower extremity. And finally, the muscle properties that we looked at specifically were the maximum isometric force, tendon slack length, and the pennation angle. So we did this in a Monte Carlo framework where we began with that deterministic model to define the baseline. We then defined input distributions for each of those sources of uncertainty and individual parameters and calculated our output distribution for confidence bounds and sensitivity. What's important here to note, though, is that we did this one simulation of 3,000 trials for all of the sources of uncertainty combined, and then we did 3,000 simulations of only looking at movement artifact or a single source of uncertainty, and then did it again 3,000 times for body segment parameters and muscle parameters. And what that allowed us to do is evaluate which source of uncertainty had the largest influence over when compared to the overall condition of considering all of the sources of uncertainty combined. So here's a look at some of what the results look at when we're looking at the degrees of freedom of the lower extremity for each of the stages: inverse kinematics, inverse dynamics, and static optimization. This would be an example for the hip flexion extension angle, and there's that bound size is what we're showing in that blue region between the 5 and 95% confidence bound. And you can see that for kinematics, that bound size remains relatively consistent throughout the gait cycle. If we contrast that with the inverse dynamics results here for the hip internal-external moment, you can see how that bound size between the 5 and 95% bounds changes throughout the gait cycle, particularly when you get into the swing phase, when maybe those body segment parameters may have a larger influence. And then this would be an example of muscle forces for two of the muscles that we considered the gluteus medius and gluteus maximus throughout the gait cycle. So to look at those uncertainty source effects that I talked about when we were considering each source individually, this is the bound size for the two of the quadriceps when we considered all of the sources combined. When we only look at the muscle properties, you can see that they're an extremely large contributor to that all source condition. And the second largest contributor was movement artifact. So you can see that between those two, when we propagate movement artifact all the way through, it's a very large contributor to the bound size in those two muscle forces along with the muscle properties. And then marker placement and body segment parameters had a relatively small effect. And what you can also notice here is that these bars don't sum up essentially to that all source condition. There's some interactions, some complex interactions going on when you're considering those different sources of uncertainty where they're canceling each other out and not necessarily summing up. To look at individual parameter uncertainty, so specifically for the muscle properties that we looked at, here's an example of some actual data in that correlation setup that we've defined as a nice way of looking at sensitivity, where we quantify both the correlation coefficient as well as the slope, so we can quantify the actual change in the output per change in input. And you can see this is an example of some of the sensitivity measures from the vastus medialis and one of the hamstrings, that the tendon slack length was the parameter that had the greatest sensitivity factor, which was a nice finding for us, because we knew that that was something that has also been shown and something that has been seen out in the literature. What we found when we dove into this a little bit deeper is that these sensitivity metrics are highly dependent on when in the movement you're assessing your sensitivity metric and what specific metric that you're looking at. And so I just want to stress that when you're evaluating sensitivity, that you ensure that you're looking at the specific area that you're most interested in, or you're evaluating a metric that's robust to the changes that you might see when you evaluate sensitivity. Now getting into some of the advanced mean value metrics, we know that in order to calculate a plot like this between, to get those nice 5 and 95% confidence bounds for Monte Carlo like this, it's a nice continuous graph. It takes thousands and thousands of iterations to do that. Using the advanced mean value method, we can come up with an approximation. And if we do it systematically throughout the gait cycle, so for instance, dividing the gait cycle into 20 individual pieces, we can begin to estimate what those parameters would be at a much lower cost if we, again, do it at a specific time point and specific probability level and systematically do that throughout the gait cycle. So we did an A and B accuracy comparison between Monte Carlo, where we evaluated the specific stage of muscle properties at the quadriceps. So we did a Monte Carlo and compared it to A and B at 20 time points during the gait cycle and 2 probability levels. And so what I'm plotting here in the results is the rectus femoris at 2 of those 20 of the time points. The histogram results are the Monte Carlo results, and the red lines there indicate the 5 and 95% confidence bounds that you would calculate between Monte Carlo, and the green lines indicate the 5 and 95% confidence bounds that you would calculate from A and B. So what we saw was that A and B was 98.2% accurate when compared to Monte Carlo, but it completed in 4.3% of the time. We didn't lose any of the importance or sensitivity information when we did the A and B, so I compared the A and B sensitivity factors to what we got out of the Monte Carlo, and what you see is they tell the same story. It's not an apples-to-apples comparison, but they're telling a similar story there, so you're not losing that sensitivity information, which I know a lot of people are going to be interested in, especially when you can do this in a much more efficient manner. So now what I'm going to get into is actually using the probabilistic tool that we've built here. I'm just going to walk through a basic example of body segment parameters in inverse dynamics using the Matlab GUI, generate some results, and then I think we can move to some questions. So then this is the cover of that user's manual. If you have that out or you want to follow along in that, I'm going to just work through that user's manual. So, okay, so is it still coming through okay? I hope. This is just my Matlab GUI here, and I'm gonna I've got it already sort of set up in the directory with all of the functions and everything that you would download off of the SimTK. So if you took that zip file and then just navigated your MATLAB to this after having set up sort of your MATLAB to OpenSim interface, you'd be able to then run these exact same commands essentially. So I'm just going to launch the GUI here. And the first thing, so now I'm just going to kind of walk through the individual steps and clicks that you would need to go through that example. So the first thing it's going to ask you for is to load a probabilistic setup file, yes or no. And this is something that I'll touch on again at the end, but we don't have a setup file yet because we haven't created one, so we'll just say no to that. And then it's going to walk through this initial setup, so we need to select the model file. The other thing I need to mention is that I've done some setup already where I've created some simulations already. So what this requires is that you have already created that baseline simulation that we've touched on, and then this then takes that simulation and puts it into the probabilistic type of an analysis. So what I'm going to do is select those baseline simulation files that I've already set up here in the inverse dynamic setup, the model. Open that. I'm going to select the setup file for it. And then it says, what tool do I want to use? I want to use inverse dynamics. And then it wants to run the baseline simulation to make sure that everything is A-OK. It's going to create a little visual of the model just because that's just something that I've set up for it to do. And then it wants to, it's done running that baseline simulation, and it wants to select the results file. So I go into what I've sent that to and select the inverse dynamics results. Now that we're getting ready to go into where the probabilistic piece would be, it wants to know, do you want to store all your output data? Which is something that we recommend, but it's not necessarily something that you have to do. If you're generating thousands of trials, you may not want to store those. It would keep them all in your MATLAB directory, and so you could still generate your results. You just wouldn't necessarily be storing each individual file. However, we find that if you do store them, you can always go back, use them later, build more. So if you need to run more simulations, you can use the ones that you've already stored. So this is just something that we recommend that you do. Now, the second pane here is to define what type of input parameters you want to analyze. So this right now is set up to look at body segment parameters and muscle parameters. This is where the bulk of the development goes into, though. So if you want to do something very specific, this would be where we would be making any changes. We're going to look at, it's now gone into the model file and selected the bodies and the parameters that we can look at. And for this example, we're going to look at the tibia and the femur, and we're going to evaluate the mass of both of those segments. The next thing it's asking is if we want to use the baseline model values as the means for the probabilistic inputs. So it wants us to define a mean and a standard deviation for the inputs that we're looking at. And we can do that individually if we wanted to set our own mean. But if you want to use the initial values that are in your model file as your mean, that's what this question is asking. So when I hit continue, it's going to ask for those inputs. It's already filled in the means because I've said that I want to use what's already in the model. And then I need to define the standard deviation. So these are, again, values that we've taken from the literature that are a reasonable distribution for these particular parameters that are in your user manual. And I'm just going to enter them here. And then the final pane here that I'm going to run is the probabilistic setup. So do we want to run the Monte Carlo or the advanced mean value? This specifically, we're just going to do the Monte Carlo. Advanced mean value is really set up to do some more complex simulations. So anything, as you get into using CMC or something that's more longer running, that's where I think you're going to find the most benefit from using the AMV. So we're not going to get into that right now. So for then the Monte Carlo setup, we need to define our start and stop numbers. So it's going to ask us, it's basically how many iterations you want to run, but I have it set up here to go from start to stop. So we're going to start at 1, and we're just going to run 30 trials right now. But if, let's say I've run 30, but I figured out that I need more for it to converge, or I want to assess how, if more simulations will provide a better result, I can then go and run from 31 on, is the point there. And then the probabilities, we can look at any probability levels that we want. It's here to look at 2, and so we have been talking about the 5 and 95% confidence bounds. And then it's gone in and read our baseline results file and selected the potential outputs that we could look at. And so it wants you to define which particular outputs you want to look at. You can look at them all, or for this, we're just going to look at 3 of the outputs. The sagittal plane, so at the hip, knee, and ankle. It's going to ask if you want to visualize your results. So I've written a visualization quick script that will generate some plots at the end of this, and it's just a recommendation for how you could potentially look at these. So if you want to say no, it won't run that, and it won't pop those plots out at you. And then the last thing is to save the probabilistic setup file, which is right back where we started. So if you hit save, it's going to save all the information that we've done there, so that you don't necessarily need to go through and click these again. It's in that same sort of XML format that OpenSim setup files are in, and so hopefully that will be something familiar to OpenSim users. Let's see. Already got that. And we'll go ahead and hit continue, and it's going to start running the inverse dynamics trials. This only takes a couple minutes, so it should complete here pretty quick, and it's going to give you a little status of the progress. So then those results plots will come up, and we can go through those. But then also, I think I don't know how we're doing on time, but if we need to get into, if we want to start looking at or taking some questions and things like that, we can do that as well. Okay. So then these would be those the results files that we looked at for this example. These are the bounds plots. The first thing that pops up are the bounds that we already sort of looked at, and we can see that we've got some variability here in the hip flexion moment and the knee moment by varying the tibia and the femur mass, but nothing in the ankle, which is exactly what you would expect, because we haven't done anything that would affect that ankle moment. And then the sensitivity plots here that again sort of show our relationship and the slope. And so nothing in there again at the ankle, which is just sort of a check, I guess, for us. And then at the knee, we can see that the femur, that they were really sensitive to tibia mass, but not so much at all to the femur, which is again something we would expect. And then here at the hip, we can take a look. This is where it becomes a little more interesting, because we can see that we were much more sensitive to the tibia mass than we were the femur, which may be something that we'd be interested in. Final plot that we look at is what 30 trials, essentially, what type of a distribution 30 trials gave us, and how normal that is. It's something that we want to take a look at as far as deriving any sort of inferential statistics from this, to sort of see if we've run enough trials to get a nice distribution, essentially. And you can see the 30 trials did okay for our knee moment, but not at all very well for the hip flexion, and we would again need to do many more than this. But for this example, I think that was that. So I think to wrap it up, moving forward for the type of things that we are focused on as far as progressing this project, we're constantly sort of improving and adding to that MATLAB code. As I said, a lot of the development comes in whatever specific problem it is that you may be looking at, which requires changes and additions to that MATLAB code. We're looking at clinically relevant applications, specifically for those AMV pieces, because we can develop some more complex simulations and then run some AMV types of simulations that may have more clinically relevance, and getting away from this sort of uncertainty things that some of our clinical partners might be more interested in. And finally, we're building these applications also in Python for those users that may not have the MATLAB license. We've already looked at effects of filtering parameters and have some scripts in Python, as well as the beginnings of Python GUI that would essentially function very similar, but would be written in Python and potentially function more like a plugin that would operate right within the OpenSim GUI. And that's all that we had.
All right, thanks, Brad and Casey. That was really great. So great to get some theoretical background, some results, and also to see hands-on that the tool worked and your live demo worked too. That's always good. So now we have some time for questions. So as I said at the beginning of the webinar, all the questions will be text-based. So you want to find the Q&A panel of your WebEx controls, and then type in your question and make sure you select to ask all panelists so that we can see your questions. And I guess, Brad and Casey, as we go to answer questions, for some reason, Casey, you're a bit louder than Brad. So Brad, maybe make sure you're right up to the microphone so we don't alternately blast people if they turn up their microphones or things like that. So let's go ahead and get started. We already have some questions that came in. The first is from Jacob Barhak. His question is, do you model the sources of uncertainty as independent variables, or are they correlated to each other?
I'll take a stab at that. Can you hear me, Jen?
If you can be a little louder, that would be good.
Right. We do model them as independent distributions. However, when we do the analysis, for instance, through Monte Carlo, the distributions then become not dependent upon each other, but they do interact with each other. And so if there are two distributions that are correlated with each other, at least from the sensitivity, we would expect to see similar results. So we would see a similar slope as well as a similar correlation if those data are correlated with each other.
Okay, great. I had a question now. So this is about the results that you presented for some sensitivities for inverse kinematics and inverse dynamics and static optimization, I think, muscle forces. So you were looking at the sensitivity of the actual magnitude of muscle forces predicted, I believe. Could you also, or have you tried looking at something like offset timing of muscles instead of just the muscle force magnitude as an output?
Yeah, we did look at that, and I forgot to mention that we picked a specific, because again, when you're evaluating sensitivity, you need to pick your specific metric, and ours was the peak muscle force when we were talking about muscle forces. And you did touch on a nice, an interesting piece of some of the data that we did put out there, that those the timing of those muscle forces also had some variability with the sources of uncertainty that we considered. We sort of traced that back to the uncertainty sources that we were looking at as far as movement artifact, as well as those body segment parameters affecting when you may see a muscle come on or off within the gait cycle, we definitely wanted to touch on that because I know that a lot of people would be interested in that timing information as well. So yeah, that was a good question.
Yeah. And another question is, as far as the inputs, so the variables to which you were adjusting, did you you said movement artifact? Did you also look at ground reaction, the sensitivity to ground reaction force, either point of application or variability in that input as well?
This is Brad. No, we didn't on this run. Part of the reason that we didn't in this paper was simply to reduce the number of variabilities that we were manipulating, but also because we tend to be kind of confident in the ground reaction force as our most confident. We were trying to find, or at least look at parameters that we thought we would have less confidence in. So we haven't run those analyses at all yet.
Okay. I think just the where your center of pressure is potentially a source of error. So it might be interesting to see to either confirm or deny that hypothesis. Right. Now we have a question from James Dunn. So he's wondering where you got the standard deviations for your muscle parameters.
So those we wanted to be as diligent as we could in defining the input distributions based on sort of what we thought was a reasonable amount of variability in those, and we did that by sort of scouring the literature to see what was out there, so for each one of those input parameters, we have provided the references for where we got those, if you want to look at specifically where those are, and they're all in the user's guide. But those came out of the actual, one specifically for muscle forces came specifically from the anatomy and the cadaveric studies that were used to define the models in OpenSim. And so I believe they came out of the one for the Arnold model. There's a Ward study, I believe, that I used. And a Frederickson study as well, that are both sort of cadaveric studies that have been used in the development of these types of models.
Okay, great, thanks. We'll check out the user guide. Now there's another question from Jacob Barhak. So his question is, so is your main goal figuring out how your results are sensitive to a specific input, or are you trying to see how variability in the population, for example, anthropometric measurements, affect your results?
That's a great question. It's both. So we can kind of cut this into two pieces, and we didn't make a big deal today about doing that. One is in subject-specific modeling, and when we use a single subject-specific model, when we vary an input parameter, what is the effect on the output? And I guess that's really kind of what we focused on today. I think that some of the really interesting parts are to then model populations and model population variability. I alluded to that briefly, actually when referencing Valente's study in which they were simulating muscle weakness in a population. But also, if we're simulating a clinical procedure, perhaps a surgery, maybe a rehabilitation, which is really, really difficult to, rehabilitation which is really, really difficult to simulate in a musculoskeletal framework. I think this does allow a tool to generate populations in which we can then apply a treatment to a population almost like an RCT to be able to then see what the effect would be generally on that population. So the extensions are in population modeling, and I think that's a really exciting area.
Cool. And then a specific question about some of the details of the tool. Is the Monte Carlo start-stop? Does that mean different random seeds that it's using, or does it use different presets parameters to start with?
No, yeah. So that's specifically generated or targeted at the number of iterations that you would want to be doing. So it's going to perform the Monte Carlo based on the way you parameterized it prior to that panel. That's just going to say, again, how many times do you want to run through that? So if you wanted to give it a different distribution, you'd have to have done that prior to that piece. But yeah, because that's just to say like I want to do another 1,000 more, but I already have 2,000, I would say. So then you go from 2001 to 3,000 in it. then allows you to access that whole data set without overwriting any of your other files or anything like that.
Okay, great. Well, I think those are all the questions that I'm seeing right now. So I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. So I really want to thank you guys for a great talk. It's really awesome that you have the paper to accompany the tool and the tool and the user guide and examples. So we'll definitely send out links to everyone who tuned into the webinar so they can try it and check it out and use it in their research. It's a great resource for the community. A couple slides just to close up, if you can advance forward for me. One more. Okay, so I definitely want to acknowledge the funding sources for the OpenSim project in this webinar series. We're supported by several grants from the NIH, and we're also supported by the DARPA Warrior Web effort. I think there's just one more slide. So thanks again to our presenters. Thanks to the audience for all the great questions and for tuning in. You can find more information about the center, upcoming events, and other resources for the OpenSim community on our website. And we'll also send a follow-up email that has links to everything that we talked about today as well. And then lastly, please fill out the survey that'll appear after the webinar ends to give us feedback on how to improve the webinar series and choose upcoming topics. So thank you again, everyone, for participating, and we hope you'll continue to stay involved with the OpenSim project. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.